Hello and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Friday, April 19th. It's no secret the U.S. debt is out of control, with the national debt now approaching $35 trillion. New reports this week shed some light on how much fraudulent government spending contributes to that debt, and the International Monetary Fund issued a warning this week about U.S. debt and how it could negatively impact international markets. Joining me to discuss this story is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, let's start with the fraud reports. What can you tell our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell our listeners that what they always suspected about the federal government is even worse than they may have thought. I think Americans have a general sense that the federal government is wasteful, it misuses money, it's inefficient. But some of these recent reports, the data on these improper payments found that the federal government has lost to federal fraud as much as $500 billion annually, right? Which is a staggering figure. The White House immediately came out and said that figure is not plausible, it's not true. But this figure did not come from a, This figure did not come from Republican think tanks or something. This came from, federal sources, a Government Accountability Office, which is, a federal watchdog that oversees many of the federal agencies like Medicaid, like Medicare, that send out checks, Dan. And that's really where this comes from. There are the difference here in how the waste is so prolific is not because there's one or two, bureaucrats who are, taking the money to buy Porsches, which we have seen at state government and other levels. But this is because these are the agencies that actually write checks to people and send them out, especially on a regular basis. And because of, in particular, identity theft, because of organized crime, setting up accounts to receive these checks and going undetected for years, fraudsters are able to steal billions, with a B, billions of dollars from the federal government. There's also a problem with just accounting where the federal government pays too much to people and after the fact, they realize they overpaid, and it's very difficult to get that money back if they even try or can do it at all. And so this has also been compounded, Dan, by the pandemic, COVID era pandemic funding, when we saw a rush of federal spending. We covered that at length on this show and at thecentersquare.com about the stimulus checks, about all the extra federal benefits, unemployment, things that came out during COVID. And that rush of spending, the rush to get that money out the door, was just gasoline on the fire of this fraud problem. So GOA report estimated that taxpayers lose between $233 billion and $521 billion annually. Brett Rowland has done some good reporting on this. So we're up to the $500 billion a year, Dan. I guess, is this the new normal for the federal government? It's hard to even take in that kind of a number.
I guess my thought on that question, Casey, is hasn't this been the new norm? It's not really a new norm. We're just really now starting to figure out how much fraudulent government spending there is. For all we know, this has been going on for years. Well, certainly there's always been fraud, but to this extent, maybe it has been to this extent for a while. One interesting tidbit that you mentioned, the Center Square reporter Brett Rowland, who's done a lot of good reporting on this. If government spending on fraud was its own government agency, meaning, there's the Department of Defense, there's the Department of Health and Human Services, et cetera. If you add up all this fraud, and again, these are estimates, it could be much higher than this. We don't have a handle on all the fraudulent spending that's going on in the federal government. But based on what we know, it would be the sixth largest agency in the federal government. That's staggering and sad at the same time.
Yeah, it is. And you point out the estimates. The fact that we don't even really know is pretty ridiculous. I mean, you can imagine if your teenager, had a credit card or something, or used your credit card, and they ran up the debt, and you asked them, "Oh, how much did you spend?" And they said, "Well, between 50 and 100,000." It's like, well, you don't even know. The fact that you don't even know how much you spent just shows a kind of carelessness. This is not what you want to hear from the government. It's like, how much money have you lost? Well, we can narrow it down within a few $100 billion of the actual target. It's just kind of crazy to see that. As you said, it would be big as a federal agency. There is a legislative effort, bipartisan in the Senate, and a new bill was just introduced in the House by Representative Jamie Raskin, a Democrat in Maryland who's on the Oversight Committee. He introduced a bill. There's a companion bill in the Senate that has bipartisan support that would really beef up some of the federal watchdogs. I think it's a good step. It could help, without getting into the details, and there can be devil in the details on these kinds of bills. But, I think it will help beef up the watchdogs, give them more power to prevent the fraud and the waste, instead of just always retroactively telling us how bad it was. So there is a little bit of movement trying to do something about this. But right now it's kind of an out of control problem. And the more we spend, Dan, the worse it gets. And really, what's something to remember is all of this money we're spending and wasting is borrowed money. It's not like this was in the Treasury. So this is all borrowed money, which means that $500 billion, we're paying interest on that, Dan.
Yeah, it's all contributing to the out of control national debt, which, as I said up top, is approaching $35 trillion. We'll get to 35 trillion. That's trillion with a T, probably this summer. And while there's been warnings about rising debt in the U.S., internally, this week, the International Monetary Fund warned the U.S. that that increased government spending and that increasing national debt are not sustainable and will hurt the global economy. Just tell us a little bit more about that in a brief time that we have left.
Yeah, I mean, the debt is rising at a breakneck pace. The U.S. credit rating has been recently downgraded. IMF is raising those concerns about the debt, headed to 35 trillion. There's kind of been a new normal post-COVID. Before COVID, our deficits were not over $1 trillion. During COVID, during the pandemic, we went well over $1 trillion, multi-trillion deficit. And then after COVID, there was kind of this idea that the deficits would go back down, but they really haven't gone back down to pre-COVID level. They're still over $1 trillion. That was kind of a watermark we had managed to not pass. But now over $1 trillion annual deficits have become normal, unfortunately. And there doesn't seem to be any push either among Republicans or Democrats that is strong enough to actually, stop the runaway spending.
Casey, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Attention parents, teachers, and taxpayers. Do you care about the decisions being made in K-12 public education? Do you want to know how those decisions impact your students and school district? Chalkboard News has you covered. We're delivering fact-based reporting on the policies that shape school safety, curriculum, and recovery from learning loss. At Chalkboard News, we're cutting through the politics and focusing on the facts behind the issues impacting students, teachers, and families. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com.